დღეს ჩვენი სტუმარია პროფესორი სტივენ ჯონსი, ცნობილი ისტორიკოსი და პოლიტოლოგი, რომელიც დიდი ხანია იკვლევს საქართველოს და საქართველოს დემოკრატიულ რესპუბლიკას და ჩვენს თანამედროვე ისტორიას. პროფესორი სტივენ ჯონსი ჰარვარდის უნივერსიტეტის დეივისის ცენტრის ქართველოლოგიის პროგრამის დამფუძნებელია, არის მაუნთ ჰალიოკის კოლეჯის ემერიტუს პროფესორი და ილიას სახელმწიფო უნივერსიტეტის პროფესორი. რადგანაც ბატონი სტივენის პირველადი ენა არის ინგლისური და ჩვენ გვინდა რომ ამ საკითხებზე საქართველოში მიმდინარე მოვლენებზე უფრო სიღრმისეულად ვისაუბროთ, ამიტომ ჩვენ გადავწყვეტეთ რომ ინტერვიუ ინგლისურ ενაზე ჩავატაროთ. Hello Mr. Jones, thank you for your time. Madloba. First of all, let's start from a general question. Let's begin with the current events in Georgia, which you witnessed when you were in Georgia several days ago. What is the situation in Georgia today since April and especially from November 28? Time seems to have accelerated and the situation has become much more alarming after April. Can we say that Georgia is now witnessing on the autocratic state, or it is just its embryo stages? Let's start from this general question.
So, Georgia is fighting a decisive battle. It's a turning point in Georgian history, whatever the outcome of this will be. It could be a return to an authoritarian state, something like Belarus, or it could be a breakthrough to a reinforced and stronger democratic state, right? When you think about Georgian history, we can think about major turning points. I mean, we could go back to the Battle of Didgori, right? When David the Builder won a decisive battle and freed Georgia from the Seljuk dynasty, control and influence over Georgia. Georgia became essentially independent after that battle. Then you can think of another turning point, Ksanisi in 1795, when unfortunately in that particular case the Georgians lost the battle, and within a few years they were under Russian influence. These are major turning points in Georgian history. One can think of others. 1918, when Georgia became independent. 1921, when the Red Army invaded Georgia and occupied Georgia. 1991, when Georgia became independent once again. So, there are, when we reflect on Georgian history, I would put what is happening now in that context. It is a major and decisive turning point in Georgian history, and we have to see what the outcome will be. My sense is an optimistic one. When I look at what is happening today, when I look at the popular resistance in the streets of Rustaveli Prospect, not only Rustaveli Prospect, but in the city of Tbilisi and in the cities of Batumi, Kutaisi, Zugdidi, and elsewhere, this seems to be a national revolt against a government that is trying to change Georgian history and take Georgia in a different direction, against the will of the Georgian people. So that's how I see it. I think if you put it in this historical context, you can see how important it is. The other part of this is the extraordinary popular resistance. A resistance that is grassroots. It doesn't seem to have a leader. It's organized, of course, but there is no central body that is directing this movement. That is also quite extraordinary in terms of the history of civil disobedience. When one thinks about civil disobedience movements, in most cases there is a leader. There is somebody that is taking this forward. And you could argue that in the Georgian case, President Zurabishvili is that leader. But that leader, Zurabishvili, she has been made into a leader by events. She's been made into a leader by the people, if you like. So she's following the popular lead. It's not that she's leading the people, it's the other way around, right? So it's really quite amazing to watch how this movement is coming together and how it is resisting this authoritarian government. And why am I optimistic? I'm optimistic because I can see all the signs of a government that is losing control. It really no longer has much control. Well, it certainly doesn't have legitimacy. That's very important for any government, right? You've got to have legitimacy. You've got to have people who believe that the government is there because it represents them. That is no longer the case. That is a very big negative for any government because that weakens the government. The other issue is what we're seeing is that people in the state administration itself, in the various different ministries, are beginning to doubt the efficacy of this government. They are also beginning to protest, as are businesses. We have the free business platform, right, where over 200 businesses are united. The majority of them, it seems, are very worried about the economy and about their existence in the economy. So when you have the administration beginning to break down, when you have businesses beginning to worry about the state of the economy, when you have a people that claims the government is no longer legitimate, what has the government got left? Well, in the Georgian case, it has Spetsnaz, right? It has the special forces. But as we know, the Spetsnaz, although they are disciplined and they are well paid, they require resources. And I'm not sure the government has the resources to continue funding Spetsnaz against 200,000 people. I don't think that's possible. The part of the reason why Spetsnaz has not been coming out on Rustaveli in recent days is because they cannot defeat over 100,000 people, let's say, in Georgia's streets, in Tbilisi streets. So what the opposition has clearly has is numbers. That's very important in a civil disobedience campaign because it doesn't leave the government with any option. The only option, let's say, is massive repression. And I don't think that Georgian Dream has the resources for massive repression. Maybe they could do that in Belarus, but I'm not sure they can do that in Georgia. So it's a very difficult situation for the Georgian government. If I was in the Georgian government, I would have packed my suitcase long ago and I would have ordered my helicopter. You know, that as I see it is the situation. However, of course, you cannot predict these things. And these sorts of situations, when one thinks, for example, if we were talking about the civil disobedience movement in India under Gandhi, right? It took decades. I don't think that's going to happen in Georgia. In Serbia in 2000, when we had the bulldozer revolution leading up to the Rose Revolution in 2003, you know, that took months as well. So this might be a prolonged process, but if you were going to ask me where the government will be in 2 or 3 months, I think they won't be in Georgia. They'll be somewhere else.
Thank you for your answer. And you talked about the resistance of Georgian people. What do you think? To what extent can the self-organization or resistance of Georgian people create a real opposition? We know that there is a skepticism among opposition parties, and there is practically no support from political elite. What do you think about this?
Well, yeah, I mean, that arguably, I would have said earlier that that is a weakness.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when the opposition parties get involved, it might disrupt this movement because political parties are not trusted by the majority of the people who are demonstrating now. I do think that there has to be some dialogue between the political opposition parties, the four major blocs, Zurabishvili, and the people. There has to be some dialogue. There has to be some unity there. But I think that the political parties have effectively been sidelined. They're not really central to this movement. But at some stage, obviously, they have to be part of it. If some sort of dialogue is going to take place, or if new elections are going to take place, clearly the political parties have to be involved at some level. But what I just want to say is that again, the analysis of this will come later, but it is quite impressive how this movement has been coordinated, let's not say maybe organized, but coordinated by groups at the grassroots level. Obviously, that at some stage will have to change. At some stage, there has to be some form of organization if you're going to take power.
Can we expect from this process a new political leader, political parties, or a political movement or something? What do you think?
Well, if you ask me, I would like to see something like a constitutional convention. I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think that what this movement has demonstrated is that there is a crisis in the Georgian political system. Since 1991, there have been over 30 elections in Georgia, both local, national, presidential, right? And none of them have seemed to really develop a strong, functioning democratic system in Georgia. I think the Georgian political system has to be reformed in a major way. It has to be democratized, decentralized, institutionalized in a different way that does not rely on elections every 4 years. Of course, I'm not suggesting you get rid of parliament. I'm not suggesting you get rid of political parties. They're very important to the electoral process. But I would like to see some result from this movement. I witnessed many decades ago in the 1980s the popular revolution in the Philippines. At the time, the phrase popular power or people's power became very popular. It became a very well-known phrase then. And I think somehow we have to try and insert people's power into what follows this political crisis. If we just have elections, yes, absolutely, Zurabishvili is dead right. We need new elections. There's no doubt about that. But that's not enough, because my fear is we have new elections, we have new politicians, we're going to go through the same process. It's going to be very difficult to create a unified government. And I would like to see some real introspection among Georgian political leaders about how democracy can be strengthened so that we don't go through these crises yet again.
Yeah, thank you. And I also want to ask about sovereignty, that Georgian Dream has frequently talks about all the time. And independence from West Europe and US, and the sensitivity of the family, and also we constantly hear Georgian Dream experts talking about decolonization and imperialism. They claim that they do not need legitimacy from the West, yet they eagerly await Trump's inauguration on January 20, expecting his support, etc. From your perspective, what kind of sovereignty are they referring to? Kobakhidze directly stated that everything will be as Trump says.
Their expectations of Donald Trump are purely speculative.
Yeah.
It's, in my opinion, Zurabishvili, for example, we know has already met Trump. She has made the case for the opposition. The government, the Georgian Dream government, has no, as I understand it, no communications with Donald Trump and the incoming administration. You know, Georgia is not particularly important for Donald Trump, and he has appointed somebody to as Secretary of State, that is the person in charge of foreign policy, Marco Rubio, who is pretty anti-Russian. So there's no guarantees at all, because Trump comes to power, that he's going to take a pro-Georgian Dream position. He's unpredictable himself, right? We don't know exactly what his policy was going to be. So what does sovereignty mean, right? So the state controls, let's say, its own borders, its own policies, right? But where does that sovereignty come from? It comes from the people, right? That's where sovereignty is. It's in the Georgian constitution, right? That sovereignty is in the hands of the people, right? So what I'm trying to say here, sovereignty is connected to the people, right? But if you're trying to reduce democratic rights, which the Georgian Dream government clearly is, as we watch legislation that it introduces, particularly of minors, right? You know, that is a law that's going to introduce censorship, and it's going to reduce the autonomy of universities and academic and political freedom. That is not what I would call protection of sovereignty. You know, when Georgian Dream is talking about sovereignty, essentially what they're talking about is keeping their power. It's not about giving power to the Georgian people. That's my understanding of what sovereignty is. What they're following is a model that is not sovereign. That is a model like Hungary or Russia, where there is a small oligarchy that keeps power and controls the population rather than shares power with the population or responds to popular demands, which is what a sovereign democracy is. And that is not the case in Georgia. That's not what they want.
Yeah. Thanks. And it is important to address the election of Trump. What does this election mean for America, American people, and its interest for the world, for us, in your opinion, and for Ukraine?
Yeah, you know, obviously, when we're thinking about Georgia and its future, we have to think about Ukraine.
Yeah.
And we have to think about Russia and how the war will end. Many people now are already talking about peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. The question is what the outcome will be of those elections, of those negotiations, rather. You know, Donald Trump has said that he'll be able to fix it, and that there will be peace between Russia and Ukraine. But it's the nature of that peace that is extremely important. Donald Trump, you know, it's very hard to say what he will do. He is primarily an isolationist, which is not good for Georgia. That is, he wants to withdraw US from international politics. For example, in Syria, he's already said, we want nothing to do with Syria, although the US clearly has interests in the Middle East. He's said that NATO, for example, is something that the United States does not need. You know, these are all warning signs that Trump's foreign policy could be very bad for Georgia. Because if a peace agreement is arranged with Russia that favors Russia in any way, it's very likely that Georgia will slowly become part, once again, of the Russian sphere of influence. And that is also bad for the Caucasus region as a whole, because that also will damage Armenia's attempt to create some independence for itself away from Russia. So, we don't really know what the outcome will be. We'll have to wait. But I am very skeptical of Donald Trump's foreign policy, and I think potentially it could be very damaging for Georgia.
Yeah, I agree with you. And let's move on also on Georgian Dream. How would you characterize the rule of Georgian Dream, and how does it differ from its predecessors? For instance, can we say that the Georgian Dream is a continuation of UNM, or are we dealing with something different from economic policy, from police forces, etc.? How they stand apart?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Nadia, I interrupted, but in many ways, Georgian Dream is a continuation of a pattern that we've seen in Georgian politics over the last 3 decades. That is, you have initially what seems to be a democratic breakthrough. You have a government that is claiming it's going to integrate with Europe, it's going to strengthen democracy, it's going to improve the economy, all these things, right, that are promised. They were promised under Shevardnadze, they were promised under Saakashvili, they were promised under Ivanishvili in 2012. And we can see the result, right? So there is a pattern there, and this is very important to understand, and it has to be explained. Why is it that every time we see a democratic breakthrough, that in the end you have an authoritarian and corrupt government? Like Saakashvili, like Ivanishvili, right? That requires some thought and investigation. On the other hand, although you see this pattern, Georgian Dream is different in the sense that it's anti-Western. Saakashvili was pro-Western. He was always looking over his shoulder to think about how will Europe react to my policies, right? I have to moderate my authoritarian tendencies because I want to be part of the European Union. That was Saakashvili generally. In the case of Georgian Dream, they don't care about the European Union. Although I think that's a big mistake because I think Georgia needs the European Union in order to improve the Georgian economy and to find its place, let's say, in the global economy. It's a small country. I think it needs the European Union in order to thrive. But the Georgian Dream is rejecting that idea. The other thing about Georgian Dream is it seems to be following a well-established authoritarian model that we see in countries like Hungary and Slovakia. There has been an ideological shift in Georgian Dream from being at least ostensibly a sort of liberal ideology in the early years after 2012.
It's a beginning. They say that we are social democrats.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now you have a government that has very conservative values. It looks to Viktor Orban's regime, as I said, as a model, as an authoritarian model, where you leave some political space for the opposition, but essentially you have an oligarchy that controls the country. That's what the situation is in Hungary. That's what the situation is in Russia. This is what Georgian Dream wants. So in that sense, I think it is different because its aspirations, its goals are different from they were under Saakashvili and Shevardnadze.
Yeah. But from the economic view, they are both neoliberal and they are at the same ship. Yeah.
Yeah. they're both neoliberal, but you can already see with Georgian Dream that the open economy that in some sense is necessary for the economy to grow is being undermined by a concentration of economic power. That was true also under Saakashvili. But uh, the signs, I think, are already visible that, I mean, the Georgian economy really has never really functioned uh, properly in terms of providing economic security to its citizens. Very high unemployment rates, for example, in Georgia. But I think what we're seeing now is businesses themselves worried about the state of the Georgian economy. They're worried about the value of the Georgian currency, of the lari. Um, they're worried about foreign investment in Georgia, right? All of which are important stimulants to an economy like Georgia, which in many ways is dependent on the global economy, right? It doesn't really produce much itself. It depends on exports and imports to function. So I think there are real signs now in the let's say in the longer term that unless there's some resolution to this crisis, that it's going to spread into the economy. And that's when eventually, at least I believe, this government will fall.
Before November 28, in your article, you mentioned that the short-term future look very grim for Georgian democracy. However, you also noted that Georgia is not Azerbaijan. Have your views shifted since then? Can
Yes.
Georgian democracy survive or prevail against
Yes.
this regime? What would your expectations?
Right.
Yeah.
So I did write that article in which I felt that Georgian Dream was in control. This was before November 28th announcement of Kobachidze that they were suspending negotiations for accession to the European Union. But things changed after that. Things really changed. It galvanized the Georgian people. This is the thing that the Georgian government is constantly making mistakes, and its mistakes are not leading to greater control as they think they will. They're actually leading to greater opposition and greater resistance. And in some sense, I think this is inevitable because the Georgian government is isolated. Um, it has fewer and fewer options other than repression. These seem to be the only options it has left. And repression is going to lead to more resistance. So that would suggest it doesn't have any options at all. So, my sense is when the Georgian government, Georgian Dream, is facing such massive resistance nationally, not only in Tbilisi, but throughout the country, that the end is near. So that's why I describe myself as being somewhat optimistic.
Yeah. That's true. I agree with you. And the last question, in your last article, I also have written this, and you pose the question that are we witnessing a revolution in Georgia? To what extent can we call the process a revolution, and how long you think this process will last? You mentioned that this may last 2 or 3 months, but how long this may last, and what will be the end of this process?
Right.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and revolutions are very long processes. When we think about revolutions, very often, we think of about one day when power is overthrown, or 1 year, like 1789, right, or 1776 in the case of the United States. But revolutions are much, much more complicated than that, and they have deep roots. And I would say that's true about this crisis too. It's not just about, Europe versus Russia. It goes much deeper than that in terms of, are the Georgian people going to regain their rights, and is Georgia going to become a genuine democracy that won't go through these repetitive crises? Um, I, at the same time, I don't think we are seeing a revolution as such, because the demands are for a return to greater democracy, right? It's not as if there is uh, some greater ideological goal here to change the nature of the political and economic system, right? Which is normally what revolution requires, right? But it is, in another sense, it is a revolution because it is the expression of popular power against the government. That in some sense makes it a revolution, but it's a revolution with a very moderate goal, if you like. And that goal, of course, is to return the rights to Georgian citizens.
Uh, Thank you and for your great answers. And if you want to add something that I might have not asked, you can add or advice for Georgian people or something that from US from you.
Yeah, Nadia, I just want to say that when we look from afar, I did come to Georgia. I spent time on Rustaveli Avenue, and I met with extraordinary people who come out every night and resist this authoritarian government. Um, and I think myself and many of my colleagues here in the United States and in Europe are very impressed with how Georgian people have behaved. They behaved in a very peaceful manner, which is very important because once it gets violent, we don't know what could happen. Uh, Violence probably would be to the benefit of the government. The fact is that the Georgian people are keeping it peaceful, and I think this is the way forward. And eventually, the government will simply fall from these pressures from overwhelming numbers of Georgians who don't want this government anymore. I'm just, I'd like to say how impressed I am and how supportive I am for what the Georgian people are demanding. That is freeing political prisoners and establishing new elections. So I wish you well.
Yeah, thank you for your interview and for your support and for everything from Georgian people.